Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome. Welcome to our fellows here at Radcliffe and to those joining us online. I am thrilled to welcome you all to the first Fellows Public Talk this year. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'm going to say a couple of words about the Q&A session that will take place at the end of the talk. To submit your questions, please use the Slido link. The Slido link is provided on these posters on the side of the room and in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar for our online audience. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time throughout the program, and we will address them at the end of the talk. Thank you. Our first speaker this year is Daniel Immerwahr, a historian of Northwestern University. If you were to imagine a map of the US, you probably picture a contiguous blob of states bound by oceans to the east and west, and by Canada and Mexico to the north and south. If the US had a logo, it would be this shape. The problem with this logo is that it does not accurately represent the United States' actual borders and its comprehensive history. In his book, How to Hide an Empire, Daniel appends this neat portrayal of the mainland US by telling the story of American history from a new perspective, its colonies. Through meticulous archival research rendered into razor-sharp prose, Daniel takes readers on an odyssey that begins with the acquisition of the uninhabited Guano Islands and spans the globe, challenging readers to reconsider the essential role of the territories in shaping US history. Daniel continues to invite us to explore the past with fresh eyes. A brief history of the 19th century reveals fires raging city after city from Portland to Boston. During his year at Radcliffe, Daniel will be working to complete This Too Shall Burn, a book that explored the United States' reliance on wood as both building material and fuel, and the combustibility of early American cities. Using catastrophic fires of the past, Daniel reframes major events in the United States history with the built environment at its center, illuminating what it was like to live amidst perpetual looming threats of environmental disaster. He hopes that in giving readers a graspable past, they can use history to navigate an uncertain future. Today, the Q&A session of the talk will be moderated by Radcliffe Fellow Jennifer Durr. And now please join me in welcoming to the podium Daniel Immerwahr.
Hi, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm also terrified because I'm going to talk to you about a book that I have not started writing. But I find that is more fun to think with. So this is ideas in their early speculative stage, and hopefully that will help us have a productive conversation. Okay, so the book I am working on proceeds from two observations that are so simple that it's almost embarrassing to say them out loud. And these are not secrets, these are things that not only historians know, but most people know and acknowledge, and I'm hoping to sort of supply a new meaning to them. So the first is the one anticipated by the first slide, which is that America and then the United States has been unusually wooden, both in terms of the number of trees that it has contained and then in the woodenness of its architecture. This is a picture of, engraving of Chicago, where I live in the 1870s. Chicago was a lumber processing center and a comprehensively wooden city, with the result, not just in Chicago, but in other places, that America and then the United States was also unusually flammable, fire-prone, given to having huge fires like Chicago's Great Fire in 1871. Boston had a Great Fire the next year. These are quite common in US history. And the reason that I'm interested in this is that the relationship between wood and fire in American history up through about World War I think resembles the relationship that we're thinking through right now with fossil fuels. So I would phrase it like this. Fossil fuels are the source of our abundance. They are not just a fuel that we use as an energy source. They're also often a precursor to the plastics that surround us. So in so many ways, our world is underwritten, undergirded, subsidized by fossil fuels. They're a source of our abundance. They are also, as we're coming to realize, a likely source of apocalypse. And so we have to kind of think through our uneasy relationship with fossil fuels. What I want to propose is that same relationship, wood as the source of abundance, wood as the source of ecological catastrophe, was very much alive in America up until World War I, and people knew about it, thought about it, and had to kind of have some way of living with it. What I'm going to do today is not present the book in whole. I want to present a sub-argument in the book, one I'm particularly working on right now. What I'm trying to do is to use the wood-fire relationship to open up some new questions and possibly, address some older questions within American history. So this is one example of that. What I want to argue today is that the wood-fire relationship, particularly the abundance of trees in North America, had a special relationship to a historical process that happened in North America, which historians call settler colonialism, the violent dislodging of indigenous people and the implantation of settler societies in their stead. And so the argument that I'm going to make is that the availability of wood and the sort of extensive woodlands accelerated this process of settler colonialism. How? Well, having wood, cheap and easy wood available, did two really important things. On the one hand, it made building things a lot easier. It is just, you can build so much more quickly out of wood than if you are forced to work with stone or clay or other building materials. So wood makes things easy to build. Wood also made things easy to destroy. A thoroughgoingly wooden landscape is also an easily burnable landscape, and that would be an important sort of framing feature of settlers' lives and of indigenous people's lives as well. The argument that I'm going to make is about North America, and I'm going to restrict myself to the land that becomes the United States. But I think the argument actually works for a number of other societies. There are many places where settlers displace people who are living there, but some of the most famous cases that we have in mind, parts of Australia, Canada, the United States, these are heavily forested landscapes. So I think the special relationship holds in other places. But I do want to particularly direct our attention to the lands that become the United States, which we don't always think about this, but in a lot of ways they are, up until the 20th century, the Saudi Arabia of wood. A land that is just so well endowed with a natural resource that it's not just meaningful for the people who live there, but it's quite noticeable for people who are outside of there. Just to give you a sense of this, today, still today, the world's tallest, oldest, and heaviest trees reside within the borders of a single country, the United States. That's that has to do partly with the fact the United States is quite large, so has a lot of opportunities to get those trees. But nevertheless, that's an interesting fact about the country, and I think one that we don't always dwell on. Obviously, if you've traveled the country, you know that not the entire country is forested. What we are talking about a country that is heavily forested in its eastern half and its western coast, and there's this kind of large arid zone in the middle where there are fewer trees. But when the English first laid eyes on North America, the part they saw was the heavily forested eastern part. And, well, what did it look like to them? We have the observations of a mathematician and scientist, Thomas Harriot, who was among the first English observers to go and to really record in detail what he saw. And what he saw was the land around Virginia contained, in his mathematical estimate, an infinite store of wood. And I think you have to understand two things are happening. On the one hand, he's just looking around stunned by the hyperabundance of trees. On the other hand, part of the reason that he's stunned is that he's coming from England, which had undergone, like many populated parts of Eurasia, quite serious deforestation in the centuries before. So not only does he notice how many trees there are in Virginia, he immediately compares this to the want of wood and dearness thereof in England. We have very little of it and we're running out of it. Oh my God, they have so much of it. Let me talk for a second about the we have little of it and we're running out. There are all the process that we associate with the kind of lead up to the Industrial Revolution, all the kind of, bustling economy that's happening in the early modern period. All of that leans heavily on the forests, and if England isn't facing an outright timber famine, it's easily facing something that we could characterize as a timber drought from iron making, which consumes an enormous amount of wood, glass making for the same reason. We don't always think about how much wood a navy requires. Navies require enormous amounts of wood. The ships have to be kind of built, they have to be rebuilt. Often you need extremely tall trees to make the masts. All of that strains English timber supplies such that in the 16th century, in a short period, the price of firewood doubles. And if you think about firewood as not just, a quaint commodity in case you want to have a fire, but as the energy supply that you need if you want your home to be heated enough that you can survive, you realize what a serious thing that is. So that's what it looks like from the English perspective. Let's talk now what it looks like from the perspective of settlers who arrive with axes into this kind of wooden wonderland. When they get there, they experience a ubiquity of wood that is sort of mind-scrambling for many people who had come from England. Wood both serves as an easy fuel, allowing settlers to live in climates that would be otherwise quite difficult to live in. They can just sort of keep feeding the fireplace without much difficulty. But kind of more strikingly, wood is also a potentially ubiquitous material. Wood is pretty easy to work and can take many forms. There's a lot of things that can, in a pinch, be built out of wood, and if you are just absolutely surrounded by this stuff, it is quite likely that nearly everything around you will, in fact, be built out of wood, and that's what happens in the American colonies and later the United States. I don't want to go through all the examples, but there's one that I love, which is how you divide property, how you divide one property from another. There's kind of typical English-British ways of doing this are to have you might have a hedge that would demarcate the boundary between two properties. You might have a brick wall. You might have something just called a ha-ha, which is a ditch. That's it. So you just, that's how you do it. You just remove some of the earth, and then if someone falls in it, well, that's their fault. In America, what you see instead is a extraordinary profusion of wooden fences. And the sort of dominant fence form is also the most astonishing fence form. It's called the zigzag or worm fence. And if you just look at it, what you will immediately see is this is not a fence that takes a lot of expertise to make. In fact, all you have to do is just sort of chop a tree down, like little carrot sticks out of it, and then just stack them up there. You don't need any metal to do it. It just kind of stays in place. And if a fence post falls off, you just put it right back on. I had kind of known this mythology of Abraham Lincoln, that he'd had a humble upbringing and had been a rail splitter. And I will confess that I didn't actually know what it was to be a rail splitter. A rail splitter is the guy who makes the rails for the fences. So here's Lincoln being commemorated on a penny, splitting or sitting on a log that he's soon to split into rails with a special mallet that you use for that. The zigzag fence is really good for hasty, unskilled labor. There's a lot of reasons why economically it makes sense. It is a shocking use of material. The amount of wood that goes, and we have these kind of accounts of, English travelers coming over and looking at some of these and just sort of writing, like they can barely believe it. You took an oak tree We could have made a navy with that oak tree. You took an oak tree and it's just this fence. Like, you could have dug a ditch. It would have been basically worked as well. And suddenly, just like this enormous oak tree is just this very inefficient fence because it was a little faster for you. But that's the kind of atmosphere that you see in the colonies. And it subsidizes, in some sense, everything. So there's a progression of homes, some of which are sort of iconic and you'll recognize, where when settlers arrive in an area and quickly need shelter, they can build a lean-to out of just sticks and cover it with bark, and then they might use that as shelter while they hastily prepare a log cabin, which is also famously just sort of built out of rude wood, and then that might be the staging ground for a little later, once things economically develop, into a wooden frame house with clapboard siding or something like that. It's one of the kind of interesting things about architecture in America is that it often takes architectural forms from Europe, particularly from Britain, and adapts them into wood. So this is from Cambridge in the UK, sort of a classic example of Georgian architecture. Now I want to show you Georgian architecture in the United States, in fact, a 5-minute walk from here, the Longfellow House. It's the same style, but it's just been transposed into a different milieu. My favorite example of this is the most famous painting ever painted in the United States, American Gothic by Grant Wood. This is a kind of beguiling painting, and part of it is you look at this farming couple from Iowa, and you think, what is Gothic about this? Like Gothic suggests there's something sort of horrifying about what you're looking at, and then you have to kind of puzzle it out. Do they just live miserable lives, and are we supposed to intuit that from their facial expressions, et cetera? So, many master's theses have been launched on that question. It turns out there's actually a literal answer. Grant Wood, the painter, he's from Iowa. He was driving around a different part of the state, and he passed a house. And he was like, oh, we have to stop and look carefully at the house. Because he's like, do you see what's going on with that house? Do you see what's going on with the window of that house? That is a Gothic-style window that I know, because I've traveled in Europe, that is appropriate for the sort of stone architecture of Europe, and weirdly is just like showing up on some random farmer's house in a style that is known as Carpenter Gothic, because it takes the sort of more ambitious stone architecture and transports it into a modest wooden milieu. And then Grant Wood tried to imagine the kind of people who would live in a home like this, hence American Gothic. The house that he painted is an example, one of many that are strewn around the Midwest where I live, of balloon frame architecture, which is a style of architecture that forgoes a lot of the complicated arts of joinery, where you have to have all kinds of specialists, and just uses milled wood that has gone through a sawmill and turned into planks and beams to very quickly erect a kind of cage that then can be used to build a house around. Balloon frame homes in Chicago in the early 19th century, so 1830s, 1840s, we have accounts of them where someone will arrive to commission the home. We'll just show up in Chicago unhoused. We'll quickly need a home. We'll commission a home to be built on Monday, and we'll be able to move in on Friday. These are very quick kind of operations that can be built with hammers, nails, and not a lot of skill. And US culture tended to sort of cohere around these kinds of places, these kinds of objects. There's a lot of political mythology in the United States about the log cabin, and throughout the 19th century, there's this kind of political excitement about the possibility that candidates for office might have had log cabin origins. They might be humble men of the people, and the way to denote that is to suggest that they grew up in a log cabin. This is William Henry Harrison, who was elected in 1840. He actually grew up in a mansion in Virginia, but nevertheless, the log cabin became the kind of your ticket to ride. I'm just sort of going through right now to figure out all the ways in which woodenness and markers of woodenness not just imbue the lives of settlers, but imbue their symbolic worlds as well. And I got really interested in the question of state and territorial seals. In some ways, these are not particularly interesting visual representations. It's not like people sort of think about them a lot, but a lot of thought goes into producing them. Just getting, what exactly are the set of symbols that is going to represent this great state. And what you can see, and this is not a complete set, is that many of them involve representations of trees, logs, axes, or other kinds of sort of references to the felling of wood. My favorite is the seal from Northwest Territory, which is the largest of the territories and kind of the prototypical territory from which the United States sort of worked out its politics of what it was to have a territory. The seal is just in front of a forest, a tree standing and a felled tree next to it. What could be a more succinct representation of the act of settling than that? A tree standing up and a tree that had fallen or had been felled by an axe. If you live or have spent time in any part of the country that's not heavily forested, your brain will be screaming right now, but what about the Dakotas? And it is absolutely true that not all of the United States is thickly forested. But I just want to point out that settlers were fully aware of that fact and quite nervous about it. A lot of the settlement literature is about how difficult it might be to confront the plains, particularly to confront a treeless landscape when all of the infrastructure of settlement has been wooden. This image is called Across the Continent, is often sort of used as a representation of manifest destiny, but I rarely see people point out one of the things that it depicts, which is a wood-stuffed society that is about to kind of do a moon launch and try to move some of its infrastructure into a sort of ominously bald landscape, and hopefully that, from the settler's perspective, that can be worked out. One of the ways, in fact, that settlers had of dealing with this was using the fact that wood is bulky but light enough to be moved. So there's a lot of interest in building movable homes. The idea of a mobile home does not require an automobile. There's a lot of mobile homes, frankly, like from the start, from Jamestown. But in the 19th century, there's a lot of interest in industrially producing prefabricated and mobile homes that can be moved into treeless areas. And in order to do that, producers will not just have to rely on woodlots near them, but will have to engage in industrial felling of forests to turn timber into a national commodity that can be sold on a national market to distant buyers. And this just gives you some sense, this log jam on the way to Chicago just gives you some sense of the scale of the operations as wood had to cover not just be a local crop, but had to sort of cover a national market. The effect of this on the forests was, by the 19th century, noticed, bemoaned, and one of the most eloquent reflections on it we have is a pamphlet by a man named Simon Pokagan called The Red Man's Rebuke, where he reflects on what this looks like from an indigenous perspective. He is the leader of a Potawatomi band that had been in Michigan and around Chicago. The Red Man's Rebuke he had printed on white birch bark. So the entire book is produced out of a tree, self-consciously out of a tree, as a way to remind the readers of the importance, the sustaining importance of trees, both for indigenous life, and for anyone who lives on the continent, and the great danger that has come to North America with deforestation and the cyclone of civilization. And that, I think, is a good moment to turn to the other side of the coin that I want to emphasize. Settlers with their axes and other woodworking implements are able to build really quickly and really cheaply. Settlers with their torches are able to unbuild. One doesn't want to quite say cheaply, but quickly, at least. And I think I hope this can be a slightly new perspective on the costs of violence against indigenous people within North America. Mostly when we take up that topic, and understandably and rightly, I'm not trying to dispute this, we talk about violence against people. And then there are all kinds of questions about, does that violence amount in various places, or perhaps in all places, to genocide? And there's all kinds of questions that one would ask about that. So that's often the center of the discussion. I am interested not in sort of, I mean, I'm very interested in that discussion, but from my perspective, I also want to add a different kind of violence. Not violence directed against people, but violence directed against places. Place-based violence, particularly arson, which is uniquely effective form of place-based violence within this landscape that has the power to very quickly unmake, annihilate places. And the reason that I want to emphasize this is not just that it fits the sort of environmental wood-fire theme, but I actually think it helps explain some things. I was, given that this is a kind of wide audience, I'm not sure anyone will have seen this book, but I was quite taken by this book by this historian called Jeffrey Osler called Surviving Genocide. Osler is one of the leading historians of Native America. And one thing that he keeps coming back to in this book is how, or sort of the forms of violence that indigenous people suffer. And he notices that time and time again, settlers, sometimes acting individually, sometimes acting through the state, sometimes just the US Army, they often attack native towns. And when they do so, often those towns have already been evacuated. This is a kind of consistent pattern where if Indians feel themselves to be outmatched, they might rightly retreat rather than fight a last-ditch defense of a town. And so when the white militias or US Army or whatever arrives at that town, the town will be empty, at which point, according to the pattern, which seems fairly consistent throughout centuries, the settlers will burn the town and burn the food stores with it. This doesn't really show up on a sort of lethality count, right? There's not like a direct conflict. It might be that no one died in battle in this encounter. And yet, Osler points out, a lot of people die indirectly, off stage from this. Because when you burn someone's town and food stores, you cut them off from shelter, you cut them off from food, you might cut them off from their water supply. There are all kinds of ways in which people will be, turned into refugees in an inhospitable environment and subject to all kinds of disease, hunger, stress, vulnerability to attack from rival groups. There are all kinds of things that suddenly happen when your town has been burned. And I think there sometimes can be a kind of myth that gets called the ecological Indian, the idea that native people can sort of live in nature easily as if they were like woodland creatures or something like that. But no, the way that people have of living in nature is they make all kinds of sophisticated accommodations to it. And when all of those accommodations are burned down at once, you find yourself in grave danger. There is a historian at Princeton, Emmanuel Kreike, who describes this, tries to theorize it as something called environcide. So the idea is that it is a form of warfare that hits people, but hits them indirectly. What is directly targeted is the environment, either the built or the natural environment, but the effect of this is to kill a lot of people, and yet kill them in ways that doesn't really happen in full view, or certainly not in the full view of the perpetrators. These turn out to be, from the view of the perpetrators, off-stage or backstage deaths that don't get counted. There was a semi-recent book by the anthropologist Jason DeLeon about the US-Mexico border, where he pointed out that a lot of people die at the border. They don't die directly at the hands of immigration authorities. They die as a result of a sort of immigration prevention apparatus that forces anyone who wants to cross the border to cross in ecologically quite dangerous places, and then they often find themselves dying or coming very close to death in the desert. In this way, points out De Leon, the environment itself acts as a silent partner that does a lot of the dirty work of killing. I want to suggest, along with Osler and some other historians, that this this form of violence, the place-based violence that results in a lot of offstage deaths, that this is potentially a major theme in US indigenous relations. It is certainly a persistent theme. The first arrival of permanent or intended to be permanent colonies from England, so the Roanoke colonization mission, which fails, the settlers all seem to die, and the Jamestown one, which semi-shortly after becomes permanent. Both of those, from very early on, we have accounts of settlers burning Indian villages. And it's not just in these places around Virginia, it's really throughout. This is a remarkable perpetrator's depiction of the Pequot massacre in the 17th century. This is an illustration of how Pequot Indians were killed by the guy, literally the guy who set the fire. So you see there are two kinds of violence in this depiction happening at once. The one hand, direct violence, the violence that we're used to, the violence of combat. But then you also see the Indians' houses all aflame, a massive village, and that itself does a lot of the work of violence. Now, this is not just available to settlers. Indians themselves use this form of violence when they are also trying to burn settlers out, and King Philip's War, which took place in this general vicinity, involved a lot of both ways burning. But my sense is that by about the time of the Revolutionary War, the balance tips, and it's really easy to find examples of settlers of the US military burning Indian homes and villages, and it's a lot harder to find examples after that of Native Americans burning settler towns. I just want to give one or two prominent examples. One is from George Washington, who during the Revolutionary War is not just fighting the British, he's also fighting all of the Native Americans who are allied with the British, and in his war against them, he orders what's called the Clinton-Sullivan Campaign to break the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also called the Iroquois Confederacy, and he orders the burning of dozens of settlements. He is quite explicit about what he wants to do here or what has been done. After he gets the report back, he writes about it. He says, look, on my orders, and he writes this proudly, Sullivan's men have torched 40 towns, some of them large and commodious. And then he goes on to say, the men who did this have displayed a perseverance and valor that do them the highest honor. I am showing, the illustration here is a postage stamp that celebrates the Sullivan campaign, this arson expedition that destroyed 40 towns, some large and commodious. This isn't the only time when arson will be openly celebrated in the United States. I introduced you before to William Henry Harrison, who got elected on a fraudulent log cabin campaign. He had a campaign slogan called Tippecanoe and Tyler too, which you may remember from being traumatized by high school textbooks. Tyler is a reference to his running mate. What is Tippecanoe a reference to? It is to his war heroism in a battle against an indigenous confederacy that climaxed when Harrison's men burned down not only a number of towns, but the capital of this indigenous confederacy, Prophetstown, in 1811. You can rebuild when you're building out of wood, so Indians rebuilt that town the next year, and a Kentucky militia burned down Prophetstown again in 1812. By the way, I'm just going to disambiguate. This is the Prophetstown that got burned down in 1811 in present-day Kentucky. This is not the Prophetstown that got burned down in the 1830s in present-day Illinois, just to be clear about which Prophetstown being incinerated to the ground we are talking about. And the fact that you have to disambiguate strongly suggests that this is a kind of thing that happens a non-small number of times. All of the big wars, the textbook wars that the United States fights up through World War I, the War of 1812, et cetera, all of those wars have what the historian Brian DeLay calls forgotten foes, belligerents who don't always kind of feature in our tellings of it, but who are very much part of the war, the indigenous fighters who are on every side in all of these wars. they are part of the wars, but they're fighting the wars in a different kind of way. There's a book that I like on this by a historian called Mark Neely, who thinks about the Civil War, which is a war that famously involved some arson, Union soldiers burning some southern areas. And he said, you know, it's interesting. In a wooden land, anyone can be burned out. And that's kind of a sort of mutually assured destruction scenario. And there's a lot of hemming and hawing among military commanders about, are we really going to set towns on fire? Are we going to burn civilians? We know how dangerous this is. And there is some of that, says Mark Neely. But if you think about how, if you actually read the correspondence of the men who are ordering these things, what you realize is that a lot of these burnings are strategic, curated. Okay, do this, but don't do that. Can we do that? No, let's not do it there. Okay, we finally reached a point, let's burn this area. That kind of thing. And a lot of ethical hand-wringing. Except, he says, when it comes to the forgotten foes, the indigenous belligerent. Against them, burning is apocalyptic. It is total war. Once it starts, we are burning everything to the ground, or at least that is the plan for it. This description of the Civil War, I think, is a really good description of the bifurcated thought about using arson in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and all these smaller wars that happened throughout North America. But I just want to point out that arson isn't just a military tactic. It doesn't just happen in war. It also happens as part of policing in a series, an incomplete number of which are mapped here, of Indian removals, of a kind of ethnic cleansing in which indigenous people are forced out of their homes, often to lands west. The way in which they are forced involves a sort of carrot and stick under duress set of inducements. Here's some land west where you will be safer. Your current land in the east, you will be less safe. And one important way in which indigenous people are made less safe is their homes are burned, right? That is ultimately a way to get people to leave their homes, is to set them aflame, and that happens a lot of the time. I just want to give an example of this because it's not part of any removal campaign or war. It's a form of quotidian arson, and it happens in an area that I happen to know a little better than others, which is in the Quileute village of La Push, which is on the west coast of the United States. So this is not about moving anyone further west. There is, in the late 19th century, there's a Quileute village, and a nearby white guy, we know his name, Dan Pullen, just waits until a lot of the able-bodied adults are at work, comes to the village with 2 or 3 other people, in full view of everyone who is remaining in the village, systematically sets all 26 homes of the village on fire in a bid not to make war, not to achieve some political goal, but just to personally get the Quileute land that he would like to buy, with a feeling that he can do this in the daytime. People will see that he's doing it, and he just feels correctly that he will not be prosecuted for it. So this is a major event in Quileute history, including because a lot of objects and artifacts that had stretched back to pre-contact time, pre-contact with Europeans, were burned because they're all made of perishable material, because that's what happens in a wooden land. The anti-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon, in his book The Wretched of the Earth, has this reflection on how colonialism operates with space. He's thinking about Algiers, and he says, if you look at Algiers, you'll see that it is a segregated space, and you can see an aerial shot which makes the case really clearly. The French area, the area where the French settlers lived, is built to last, all stone and steel. And the area where Algerians are consigned is a shanty town. And he's like, that's how colonialism operates. It sort of props up the living spaces of the colonizers, and it denigrates the living spaces, or makes ephemeral the living spaces of the colonized. I want to suggest that something even more extreme happens, at least symbolically, in North America, and you can kind of see it in the city that I've started us out with, in Chicago in the 1890s. After Chicago burns down in 1871, It burns down again in 1874. But then after it burns down in 1874, it rebuilds, and there's a lot of attention to rebuilding it in stone and not steel yet, but iron and other kinds of fireproof materials. And the city is built up to last. And that's really the Chicago that I live in today, which is just full of brick buildings. That's part of a kind of smart fireproofing strategy, but it's also part of a symbolic strategy, because what that suggests, not just with the durable materials, but also with the neoclassical sort of architectural forms that come with it, that often harken back to antiquity, what this all suggests is that we're here, we're permanently here, and to the degree that our buildings resemble antique forms, we have always been here. This is an architectural order that has ambitions to it being not just durable, but eternal, stretching back in time and stretching forward in time. And meanwhile, from the perspective of Chicagoans by the 1830s, the built environment had been so made over, and so made over so quickly by settlers. Chicago had not been occupied by settlers, or by very many of them, before the 1830s. This is all just happening within decades. And yet by the 1890s, if you were to look around Chicago, you wouldn't just see a kind of shanty town of indigenous space. You wouldn't see an indigenous space that would register on your eyes as such. A lot of the burning doesn't just sort of consign Native people to living in more ephemeral places. It erases Native places from the map. And this is a kind of, I like the foggy, hard to discern nature of this photograph, which corresponds to, it's a photograph of a lost place, a place in Michigan that was burned and burned in the 20th century. So that's the dynamic I have on my mind that I'm writing about, and that's the thing I'm eager to talk to you about. Okay? Yeah. Jennifer and I are going to have a conversation.
I want to start today by thanking Daniel for being our first public presentation, our first public talk, and for a really generative talk at that. I think the first question I'd like to ask you is to take us back a little bit, because in the beginning of your talk, you paint this really evocative picture of the particular styles of wood-based settlement. And yet, as you move through your talk, we become aware that there is a whole kind of civilizational structure built out of wood that is built by indigenous populations.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if you could do a little bit of description and comparison and tell us about that earlier kind of aesthetic.
Yeah, no, that's great. So when English colonists first arrive, they don't just notice the trees, they notice the architecture. And they notice a different kind of architecture than they're used to. So the indigenous towns that they see are all built out of wood, often clad in bark, using actually similar thing to the balloon frame, where it will be poles tied together and sometimes saplings, pulled in and tied with cordage that's often made of tree bark. But what's interesting about that architectural form is that it has a quality that I think is unusual or challenging for the English when they first arrive, although they kind of get into it. It's modular, it's movable, it's built of perishable materials, and it's not always expected to last. So there's a lot of thought in various native architectural traditions about how you build, what kind of shapes you have, and how they kind of correspond to larger cosmological facts. But there's not a lot of energy put on, we're going to build something and it will last for decades. Often it is, we will build something and then we will rebuild it. It has a sort of Japanese style in that way. And that's something that settlers end up adopting themselves, but it takes them quite a while to do that because they think of home as a permanent place that you just plant in.
Yeah. I next want to ask a little bit about the periodization of the text, right? So You start us off with a kind of initial process of settler colonialism. I want to just make an offhand reference to theorists who think of settler colonialism as a process without end, or that has not ended. But in thinking about this book project around a kind of ontological form of wood, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, so, right. There are two arguments, actually. One set of arguments is settler colonialism is a process, not an event, and just because there's a kind of active displacement, it doesn't mean it's over. It's now implanted and ongoing. And there's another set of arguments by historians who feel that settler colonialism is a bad description of things that happened, say, before the 19th century, when Native people actually have quite a lot of power. I'm open to both those, but I think the point that I want to make is that the process of settling works on wood, and things look different, feel different, and happen at a different pace after wood sort of serves as the first draft, and then once you get the all steel and stone phase, that's it. I don't want to say that settler colonialism is over, but that feels like a different phase architecturally and symbolically in what's happening.
Okay. So in thinking about this periodization, I also want to think about historical categories like race and gender as historicized. And so as you tell the story about wood and settler colonialism, what do those categories look like? How do they evolve? Does it work to think about indigenous history in relationship to wood, or do those histories differ quite dramatically across the eastern seaboard? I realized that was 3 questions. So.
Yeah. Let's just talk about the gender thing, because I think that's been on my mind recently. So there is, within settler culture, a strong wood masculinity relationship, like the lumberjack, the farmer who's got the axe. And my sense is that woodwork as man's work, I mean, that's certainly not a cultural constant, and I think that is not fully felt within the other cultures in North America. So part of the cultural collision is who does the work of wood, and there's a kind of European, or at least I've inherited, gendered way of thinking about architecture where all the male domain is the outside of the house and out, and the female domain is within, and I think that is not sustained in other cultures within North America, and so that's part of the intellectual flip about thinking about other people's wood cultures.
Okay. I'm going to ask some questions from our audience while also encouraging our audience to submit questions on Slido. I want to ask you a question about William Cronon. Love to ask questions about William Cronon, but specifically about the work changes in the land. So this question coming from our audience is, would you situate your analysis within that analytical tradition, and specifically in the ways that Europeans related to the built and the made environment, or is there a qualitative difference that you're really trying to narrate with this targeted destruction of the land?
So William Cronon is sort of a historian's historian, and wrote a book, Changes in the Land, about the ecological consequences of European settlement in New England, and then wrote an even more famous book called Nature's Metropolis about Chicago as the kind of hub for the hinterland of all this kind of settler colonial economy, and particularly Chicago as a lumber processing area. So he's really interested in wood and the economies around wood, not interested in fire. And it's really interesting. Nature's Metropolis is a really important, long, really thoughtful book about Chicago and wood that barely mentions the fact that Chicago burned down. He has a take on it, but it's short. So I, on the one hand, I'm really interested in this kind of long history of forest history and how the forest becomes the settlement and how urban history connects to ecological history and environmental history. But I think partly in the light of climate change, I'm also interested in the catastrophic elements of it that I think are less salient to people who were writing a few decades ago.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You know, you started your talk today with this argument about fossil fuels, and as someone from California, I naturally was thinking not of fossil fuels, but rather of forest fires, right?
Yeah.
And the kind of conversation around indigenous practices in preventing fire.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if we think this analysis of wood and specifically fire out, you know, you talked a lot about settlement in your talk today, and I'm curious, you know, how we think about fire as a very specific form of violence, and its resonance within U.S. history more broadly, but also how we think about arson as destruction or fire as tool kind of in bigger ways than just these targeted arson attacks.
Yeah. So if you talk to a forest ecologist and you talk to them about fire, they don't have the same instinctive reactions that most of us, like people who live in cities, have. Because if you live in a city, you're terrified of fire, or if you don't think about it a lot, maybe you don't think about it a lot, but there's like a huge infrastructure of fire escapes and fire safety and where's your extinguisher. And so like a fire is not a good thing. And if you live in a city, it is quite possible that you will not see a fire larger than what happens on your stove for weeks, possibly for years. And that's a really interesting and bizarre way to be a human, because most humans interact with fire in a much fuller way. We've kind of consigned most of the fires to boilers, so they happen out of sight, even though they're still fueling the economy. But if you talk to a forest ecologist, they're like, yeah, fire is supposed to happen. Fire is not itself an emergency. Fire itself is not a catastrophe. There are good fires and there are bad fires, and we have to distinguish them. And you kind of gesture to that. There's a long history of people intentionally burning the lands in North America, and that seems like that was a stabilizing factor. I've come as a historian to learn to ask the question, is it a good fire or a bad fire?
Yeah.
I think these fires that I've described are violent fires intended to harm people, and that I think succeed quite a lot at harming people, so I'm not a fan of these, but there's actually all kinds of fires that happen, some of which are economically regenerative, some of which are, revolutionary fires directed, by the enslaved against their enslavers. And I've come to realize that fire does just a lot of things for humans, and some of those things are violent, and some of those things are catastrophes, but some of them are not.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also thinking, as we think about settler colonialism, we are predetermined to think about that as a process of tremendous violence, as it was. But I'm also curious, in your research, have you found examples of settlers learning practices related to wood, related to construction, related to forest management from indigenous communities?
Yeah, there is some, and I don't really know the details on it. There's some woods burning that happens pretty early. So indigenous people manage would sort of do a form of like mega gardening by using fire to create meadows, to create transportation corridors. There's all, there's all kinds of things that you might want to do with a fire that would make the lands more sustaining. Settlers pick that up pretty quickly, but my understanding is that they also pick it up a little clumsily. And so you'll see these like really large fires in Maine that seem like they were intentionally set, but set at the wrong time in the wrong place, and grow much larger than the arsonist intended them to.
Yeah. I'm curious, sort of as the process of conquest and violence expands, and when we think about the creation of agricultural spaces, right? So as forests are being cleared in order to promote agriculture, and as the nature of colonial conquest shifts as a result of the shifting landscape, how does that story about wood evolve? Yeah,
so there's this weird way in which wood features in the ideology of settlement, because on the one hand, it subsidizes, enables, is literally the stuff of building settlement. On the other hand, so much of settler ideology is about clearing the land. And that, so John Locke famously had this theory about who could have property. And the theory was that people who used property were entitled to it, and people who weren't using it, they weren't rational and industrious, quote unquote, were not entitled to it. And so then you said, okay, well, how can you tell? And he's like, Forested land is land where people aren't using it. So forested land is free of property claims. And the difference between settlers and indigenous people is that settlers cut down the forest, turn them into farms, and that's how you know the land is being used. So, and that kind of sense of a forest is a unused landscape, is a kind of quote unquote savage landscape, that goes for a long time. So on the one hand, settlers are benefiting from woodlots. On the other hand, they have a kind of suspicion about the people of the woods, even though they are also woodlands people.
Yeah, yeah. What happens when we move fire outside of this context of settler colonialism and think about fire and arson as examples of violence, resistance, opposition elsewhere in American history, right? So you yourself had talked about populations of slaves using fire as a tool. We can also think about the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yeah.
You know, when we think about the analytical sort of concept as being fire rather than this very particular history surrounding wood, how do you think about that?
Yeah, so one of the wild things has been to look back at US history and just follow the fires, and you very quickly see racial violence. There's a lot of ways, different ways in which racial violence in the United States, either environmentally or other ways, expresses itself as fire.
Yeah.
One thing that I got really interested in is the question of whether enslaved people used fire as a form of protest or uprising. And on the one hand, you can imagine it because you think, oh, okay, these are folks who are enslaved in a highly combustible landscape. You cannot be prevented from having access to fire. You can be prevented from having access to firearms. You can be prevented from talking to your distant neighbors, but everyone has access to fire. And so you think it must have been quite tempting for someone who's enslaved to quite easily, burn down the master's house. On the other hand, the 19th century documents are just full, and 18th century documents are just full of white people making accusations that black people burn things down, and then using that as an excuse to torture and sometimes kill black people. And so you can both see, you're like, okay, is that happening all the time? People are always burning things down? Or is it never happening and it just, enslaved people become a scapegoat? So I started using, I just tried to look at it quantitatively. So I looked at 2 cities that had large enslaved populations, Charleston and New Orleans, and I asked if they were more prone to fire than their peer cities with low enslaved populations. And the answer is they had fires at 3 to 4 times the rate. And those fires went way down after the Civil War, which strongly suggests that in a way that's hard to notice because it expressed itself as a natural event, enslaved people had been setting quite large fires, and that those fires could be classed as some of the largest rebellions in US history.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking also about this intersection among fire, property destruction, continues to be a kind of trope in depictions of protests.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Didn't Trump say that Minneapolis had been burned down, the entire city had been burned down, was his expression of what happened at the debates?
Yeah. I mean, it's a theme that we can follow up till now. Someone in our audience, I think, asked this great question, which is about how you're thinking about this intervention as a broader work of environmental history. So when we think about a bigger non-human world, obviously deforestation, new settlement patterns, they impact a more than human world in conversation with human populations.
Yeah.
And is that a piece in this story?
Yeah, some environmental historians are really interested in the agency of other species than humans, and I'm very excited by that work. I am more attentive to trees when they become timber.
Okay.
So for me, what's really interesting is connecting a story about the environment to a story about what happens in cities, because often we segregate the two. So environmental history happens in rural spaces or unpopulated spaces, and other kinds of history happen in cities. But, from my perspective, cities are made out of their landscape. And the material properties of the landscape have a lot to do with what is politically possible within even large cities like Chicago.
Yeah. One final question, and again, thank you for your time today. As you framed this talk, you made the argument that this was not exactly a project about genocide. And yet, as your talk progressed, it seems to me that it very, very much is making a particular intervention in an argument about genocide. And I was just curious as to what your thoughts were about that.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to say that this is not interested in the question of genocide, but often that question is asked as a way of asking about direct violence, people to people. And a puzzle in the 19th century is that the indigenous population within the current contiguous borders of the United States drops precipitously over the course of that century. And it's hard to explain that just with the battlefield counts that we have. In fact, in a lot of those battles, it's that where we have, we know roughly how many people died on each side. It actually seems like Native Americans are doing quite well. And it's also hard to explain that population drop entirely in terms of disease, because by the 19th century, a lot of indigenous populations were fairly resistant to European diseases. And so I actually think the environ side helps you understand. It's the violence against places is the part that's visible in the historical record that is produced by settlers. And then there's a thing that happens that doesn't show up in those documents, which is what happens to people whose villages and towns have just been burned. They're under stress, they're deprived of resources, they're on the run, and that's where a lot of the dying happens. So in some ways, this helps explain why there is so much indigenous death and to some degree non-birth in the 19th century, even though if you just look at actually like how many people are killed and recorded as such, it doesn't account for that.
Yeah. I'm afraid now we have to close, so I want to thank you for your presentation and also your perspectives. I also want to thank our audience for your excellent questions. For those of you online, I hope that you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. So thank you again for joining us today, and have an excellent rest of your day.